I wish everyone who read the book read it as carefully as you have, Tim. That's right. That's exactly what we were trying to do. Binnall of America.
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 Binnall of America Audio.
There was a young fellow who told us an awful lot about his clan's interaction and knowledge of the hairy man. But one thing he wouldn't tell us was the word they used for the hairy man in his tribe. He said that this word was a word you had to say if you happened to meet one face to face. That was supposedly what you said. Now, the effect of that word, I don't know. Perhaps it was a greeting, or perhaps it was some kind of magic incantation. I'm just not sure.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, Binnall of America Audio with your host, Tim Binnall.
Hello there, my friends. This is Tim Binnall of BinnallofAmerica.com with another edition of Binnall of America Audio Season 2. It is April 21st, 2007. We are back from our little spring break. Hope you didn't miss us too much, and I hope you are ready for more underground esoteric interviews as only you can find here on BOA Audio. This week we have a very cool episode for you. I think it will go down as one of the more memorable interviews that we've ever done here on the program. Our guest is Tony Healy, co-author of The Yowie, In Search of Australia's Bigfoot. And he comes to the program direct from Australia. This interview literally spanned 2 continents and 2 days, as we recorded it on a Friday night here in America, and it was Saturday morning in Australia. In this conversation, we're going to talk about the evolution of the Yowie in Australia, from Aboriginal reports to colonial settlers seeing the Yowie, a strange blackout of Yowie news for about 75 years, and then a Yowie renaissance in 1975 in Australia, plus some intriguing modern-day reports of civilization butting up against Yowie territory, the other mysterious cryptid in Australia, the Jungidi. What is the Jungidi, and what's the difference between the Jungidi and the Yowie? You're going to find out from Tony Healy. Interesting trends and characteristics of the Yowie, the paranormal elements of the Yowie, and, of course, tons and tons more. This is a jam-packed interview. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Tony Healy, let me give you a little bit of background on him. Canberra-based Tony Healy became involved in Yowie research in the mid-1970s. Since 1981, he and Yowie co-author Paul Cropper have collaborated on many projects, notably in co-authoring Out of the Shadows, Mysterious Animals of Australia, which contained a lengthy chapter about the elusive Yowie. Over the past 30 years, they have searched for lake monsters, hairy giants, out-of-place big cats, and other semi-legendary animals in Fiji, North America, the Bahamas, Iceland, Ireland, Great Britain, Nepal, Malaysia, and every state and territory in Australia. You can find out more on Tony Healy at the website yowiefile.com, YOWIEFILE.com. Without any further ado, let's rock and roll. This interview was recorded on March 16th, 2007, direct from Canberra, Australia. Tony Healy, talking about the Yowie on Binnall of America Audio, Season 2.
I wish everyone who read the book read it as carefully as you have, Tim. That's right. That's exactly what we were trying to do. Binnall of America.
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 Binnall of America Audio.
There was a young fellow who told us an awful lot about his clan's interaction and knowledge of the hairy man. But one thing he wouldn't tell us was the word they used for the hairy man in his tribe. He said that this word was a word you had to say if you happened to meet one face to face. That was supposedly what you said. Now, the effect of that word, I don't know. Perhaps it was a greeting, or perhaps it was some kind of magic incantation. I'm just not sure.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, Binnall of America Audio, with your host, Tim Binnall.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Binnall of America Audio, and we have just a very special edition of the program for you this week. Our guest is Tony Healy, and he's coming to us direct from Australia. He's the co-author with Paul Cropper of The Yowie, In Search of Australia's Bigfoot. Tony Healy, welcome to the program.
Nice to be here, Tim.
Like I said, I'm just really excited to have you on the program. I checked out this book, The Yowie, In Search of Australia's Bigfoot, about in the last month or two, and it is amazing. I cannot speak highly enough of it. It is just one of the best cryptozoology books I've read in such a long time, and a fascinating look at a branch of esoterica in another country that really opens your eyes to, the whole sociology of what's going on there. I give it the highest recommendation I can. I hope all of the Binnall of America Audio listeners check out the book, The Yowie, In Search of Australia's Bigfoot. And now we got you on the program to talk about it. I'm so excited. Let's start out first with your bio and the background and all that good stuff, and how you gravitated toward the paranormal and the esoteric, and how your journey began.
Well, yes, that's going back a fair way now, Tim. I'm almost 62 years old, and so I think it was about 50 years ago. I was about 12 years old, and I picked up a book on the Loch Ness Monster in our local library. It was More Than a Legend by Constance White, and that got me quite excited. I thought one of these fine days I'd like to go to Loch Ness, and ultimately I did. I've been there about 4 times, but after that I glimpsed a strange animal in North Queensland one time while driving. Not tremendously exciting. It looked like an American puma. Of course, they're not supposed to exist in Australia. I just wasn't entirely sure whether I'd imagined it, but I learned later that there had been many sightings in that area of similar creatures. So that was probably something that kicked me along. And then in 1969, I was working in Canada, in British Columbia, in logging, a logging camp up near Terrace, BC, and also around Pitt Lake. And in both places, I heard stories of the Sasquatch. And it took me a long while to realize that the guys up there were serious. Some of them knew people who'd seen these creatures. And, of course, that got me quite excited, and I sometimes took a little plastic camera that I had at the time and wandered off into the trees on the weekends, but didn't see anything. And then when I returned to Australia, I was then about 30 years old. Oh, no, wait on, I'm getting ahead of myself. There was a trip to Loch Ness in the meantime there. But to cut a long story short, in 1978, I went on a 2-year round-the-world trip looking for the Sasquatch in North America for about 11 months there, and then on to Scotland to revisit Loch Ness, then to the Himalayas and also to the Malay Peninsula looking for yetis and yeti-like creatures. And on my return to Australia, I slowly gathered information on a Bigfoot-like creature here, the Yowie. So around that time I ran into Paul Cropper, and between us we've researched many Australian cryptozoological mysteries, and we put together a lot of that information in our first book, Out of the Shadows, Mystery Animals of Australia, 1994 that one was. And since then we've been working on the book about the Yowie, which you mentioned, and thanks for your kind words about it. So, yes, in that more than 10 years, we've put together all our information on the Yowie, and this book is the result of that work.
Yeah, like I said, it's just an outstanding book. Just well put together, amazing case files in there, just a wealth of material, and just tremendous. I just really enjoyed it a tremendous amount. And you can get the book obviously at Amazon.com, of course, and it's via Anomalist Books, and you can find out more there at anomalistbooks.com. Those are the places where you can go to get Yowie in search of Australia's Bigfoot. Amazing book. Let's just dive right in here now to the Yowie mystery. Before we even sort of like delve into the history of the Yowie in Australia and all that stuff, let's bring people up to date on what exactly the Yowie is. And I guess the best description would be, as the title of the book suggests, Australia's Bigfoot. But of course, there's much, much more to it than that. Tell the audience about the Yowie and describe it and what it is.
Yes, Tim. Well, as far as we know, to judge from all eyewitness accounts, and Paul Cropper and I, between us, have interviewed 120 eyewitnesses, and we have, on top of that, another 200 or so reports from colonial times and so on. It seems that people are describing something very much like the American Sasquatch or Bigfoot. We can't say for sure because nobody can say anything about these creatures for sure. But to go from the top of the head down to the ankles, it seems that there may be a sagittal crest or something, some feature on the top of the head. So it's because often people say the head was sort of dome-shaped, but rather pointy, like perhaps a man in a hooded coat, a stiffly, like a church door effect, or a football shape with a kind of a point on the top, but not greatly so, just a suggestion of a pointed top to the head. Then the other thing that is constantly mentioned is that the head rests straight on the shoulders without benefit of neck. That is almost 100% of eyewitnesses and Aboriginal law says that. Somehow or other they can still turn the head to look at you, but it seems as if the head is set straight into the shoulders. Frequently they say the head looks small compared to the shoulders or to the body in general. The shoulders are wide, they're very wide, but perhaps sloping at the same time to some extent. The arms are very long. Some people say they were somewhat below, the hands were below the knees. Often they say the hands were down about to the knees. The posture's a little slumped forward in many cases, so people say, well, the arms perhaps wouldn't have been quite so long had the thing been standing up dead straight. In general, they look like, you might say, a gorilla with long legs in proportion, the same proportion as the humans. Long, strong legs, very thick body. The torso often is said to be the same width almost all the way down. On other occasions it's said to taper somewhat. The hands appear to be human-like. Those few people who've had a good look at the hands say that they appear to be five-fingered. The nails or claws appear to be quite long in some cases, fearsomely long occasionally, people say. So the thumbnail sketch we have of the Yowie is pretty consistent from the top of the head down to the ankles. The face is said to be either the face of an ape-like man or a man-like ape. Aborigines say these things are men, but they're hairy ape-like men. Europeans or non-Aborigines, that's a bit of a 50-50 situation. Some say they're more ape-like and some say they're more man-like. almost always the skin is said to be coppery brown, black to coppery brown, rather dark anyway. The hair often covers almost all the face, right up to just below the eyes, so some people can't make a call on the colour of the skin at all. Sometimes there is said to be, the upper canine is said to be very prominent and even protruding below the bottom lip when the mouth is closed. The only area where things get very vague and funny is below ankle level, where the shape of the feet is very difficult to establish. We get a lot fewer track finds in Australia than you do in North America. A lot fewer, because I think the ground is dry and stony compared to North America. There's very little snow, and but even so, it seems strange that we have so few good plaster-cast footprints. We have some five-toed ones that look reasonably okay. We have other more bizarre shapes, but we could get into that later. But the here's a quote by an old Aboriginal elder from the South Coast, interviewed in 1954. Their word for the yowie was doolagal, because there were many different Aboriginal terms for the yowie. Mm-hmm. He says, a doolagal is a gorilla-like man. He has long, spindly legs. He has a big chest, long arms. His forehead goes back from his eyebrows. His head goes into his shoulders, no neck. And he goes on to say where they live down there. But yeah, that's about the strength of it. Something like a Bigfoot or a Yeti.
Except for the strange feet. We'll talk about the bizarre foot situation in a little bit, but that is one of the most compelling aspects of the yowie mystery. Mm-hmm. I'm telling you, this I'm really in love with the yowie now. I've enjoyed this book so much.
You must come out here, and if you come out here someday, we'll give you a tour of some of the yowie areas.
I think a yowie hunt may be on the agenda, definitely.
Well, you're always welcome.
Talk a little bit about the evolution of the yowie in Australia and how the Aborigines, it's not just a modern sort of thing. It was around with the Aborigines and evolved over time, and it's been going on since the good old days, if you will.
Yes, certainly has, Tim. As far as we can establish, virtually every Aboriginal clan from Cape York Peninsula in the north right down to Victoria in the south believe strongly in the existence of these creatures, and when you talk to the Aborigines about it, they say, well, our people have always believed in these creatures. The creatures have always been here. One or two Aboriginal legends specifically say that these creatures were here before the Aborigines got here. So they certainly do believe in them. There's cave art in Cape York depicting the yowie. We have a photograph of one cave painting in the book, and there are legends of handed down over God knows how many years of Aborigines engaging in sporadic warfare with these big hairy giants. Wow! Presumably over possibly millennia or at least hundreds of years, and resulting in the yowies withdrawing into the least accessible rocky forested mountains. So, and the Aboriginal descriptions of the yowie are very similar. They match really well the descriptions given by modern non-Aboriginal eyewitnesses today.
And what's fascinating, too, is that these, obviously the legends of the yowie were in existence with the Aborigines. And then when the Europeans started coming to Australia, they had their own yowie sightings. In some cases, they had heard about the yowie beforehand when they had run into the Aborigines. And in other cases, they hadn't really heard about it. But it brings a sort of different element into it that now when the Europeans came, the yowies, that didn't go away. It wasn't something that you'd think if it was a made-up tribal thing that no one would see it, but it turns out when these Europeans came, they started having yowie sightings.
Yes, that's the most exciting thing, I think, that the colonial era pioneers describe the same sort of thing. Paul, my colleague, Paul Cropper, he's very good at digging up early reports, and we have eyewitness reports dating back to 1847. We have strong rumours, prior to 1847 of sightings by non-Aborigines. Certainly some naturalists and officials in New South Wales were talking about these creatures earlier, and people were writing about them, writing about Aboriginal beliefs in them anyway, as early as the mid-1820s. So, yes, it goes back a long way.
And then what I found really fascinating, too, was it seems like once Australia sort of got settled as I'm not familiar with the country, with the evolution as far as the country of Australia, so I may be wrong about when it got established. But
sure.
From about the 1900, from around 1900 to 1975, as you guys point out in the book, there seemed to be just a complete lack of Yowie information, Yowie sightings. Yowie sort of fell completely off the radar in Australia for a very long period of time. Talk about what that was all about and why you think that happened, and sort of how it came out of the doldrums there.
Yes, that was odd. For many years, Paul and I used to talk about the forgotten years, or some such phrase. We couldn't work out why there seemed to be a lot of reports through the colonial era, which ended in 1901 when the states got together to form Australia, the Federation. Somewhere around about there, from there through to about 1975, which seems a very precise date, but there's a reason for that. For those first 75 years of the 1900s, there was actually no reports that we could find. We had one or two or three, but nowadays we have more because of Paul's research, but and for other reasons. But I think the reason why there was sort of a silence that came down in those years was that ironically, in the early 1900s, a lot of people were drifting from the outback to the cities or the towns. Mm-hmm. I think it was because of mechanisation of farming. They needed not so many people in the rural areas, and a lot of villages and small towns in the rural areas became ghost towns, partly because of that depletion of population in the rural areas, and partly because of the end of the gold rushes. During the mid-1800s, there were hundreds of thousands of people wandering around all over the countryside looking for gold and hearing stories about the hairy man or the Yowie. But after the gold rushes ended, the big gold rushes ended about 1890. Another factor, I think, was tragically the Aborigines at that time were pretty well defeated in frontier wars, like as in North America with the Native Americans. And a lot of the Aborigines in southeastern Australia had their world completely destroyed. In some cases, they lost their language and even their names. They were confined to reservations, partly for good reasons. I think, they were at least safe from the worst kind of frontier outlaw type people there. But they were, in the early 1900s and in the mid 1900s, when I was growing up, there was very little contact between Aborigines and most non-Aborigines. They were kind of out of sight and out of mind, and I think they kept a lot of things to themselves. They thought, well, if they mentioned a hairy man to some people, they'd be laughed at, and besides which, there is a kind of a taboo element about the hairy man law in Aboriginal society. Some Aborigines don't like to talk about it at all. But, yes, in those years too, it was a funny time. Although the modern era was coming on, the road system in the outback was just terrible. I mean, people didn't go out there for recreation much because your car would fall apart, you know. It was a huge adventure for me, even in the early 1960s, to go all the way up to Darwin and over to Western Australia and places like that. And it was pretty primitive, you know. There were no four-wheel drives. People didn't go out there. And, of course, a lot of country newspapers in that era folded up along with the small towns that they served. So we had mainly big city newspapers which perhaps, if they received stories on the Yowie, perhaps didn't want to feature them. They just couldn't believe them. So perhaps that's the story, Tim. I don't know.
And then something strange happened in 1975, as you sort of allude to, and that was this explosion of the Yowie Renaissance, if you will. Talk about what precipitated that, what caused this Yowie Renaissance, and what the mood was like as far as the cryptozoology community, which seemed to be sort of, it was like a birth almost of the cryptozoology community when this Yowie Renaissance happened. So let's talk a little bit about that.
For sure. Yes. Well, I guess most credit should go to just one guy for that, Rex Gilroy, who about 1974, 75, began to write articles for popular magazines in Australia and sometimes for the tabloids. He was based in the Blue Mountains, which is a really, really wild area to the west of Sydney. And he'd heard of Yowie stories since he was a kid. And then he had an experience in 1970 where he saw a Yowie walking across a small clearing in the Blue Mountains. So Rex went public and appealed for information about these creatures. And a lot of people responded, evidently. I have a couple of large files about Rex's his articles and the responses. I met him at that time because I had only just begun to collect one or two Yowie stories then. I've heard one from the colonial era near Canberra here, and one from the far south coast of New South Wales, which was supposedly ongoing. But ironically, I was saving madly to go overseas to look for the Bigfoot Sasquatch in North America and to carry on to the Himalayas and so on. And I just found it, well, I just couldn't get my mind around the idea that there could be similar creatures in Australia, because I had worked in almost every state of Australia, every state and territory of Australia prior to that, in remote areas. And apart from those two instances I mentioned, I'd never heard a thing about the Yowie, not a single thing. And to suddenly have this sort of inkling in the mid-70s that there could be something, I just couldn't believe it. And I talked to Rex, but he didn't offer any documentation for his claims. And I thought, well, he must be, I just can't believe this. I put it aside for 2 years until I returned from overseas. In that same time, around just before I left for overseas, 1977, Graham Joyner, who is an archivist here in Canberra at the National Archives, a very serious, erudite fellow, a scientist, totally different really from Rex. Graham put out a little 26-page booklet, which was actually jam-packed with early references to the to the Yowie, or hairy man, as it's often called, he'd stumbled over these early references in the National Archives. And his book appeared as virtually as I had my air ticket in my hand, ready to go overseas looking for the Bigfoot. But I got together with Graham, and I thought, well, there is something to this. I guess, I'll check it out when I get home. But certainly by between 1975 and 1980, a small number of people, such as myself and Paul Cropper and Graham and Rex, were starting to collect stories, and then in more recent years, with internet and microfiche and all that stuff, Paul has been able to delve back into those forgotten years prior to 1975, and now we have quite a few stories from the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and 50s, and so on. So we filled in those years, and we've both been lucky enough to go and interview some of the old timers who were still alive. So we have
awesome,
more or less filled in that blank. Yes,
it's really that's fascinating about just how it sort of became, I don't know, sort of just began then in 75. It's really a strange situation in a way.
Yeah.
And so would you say that today, in the modern day field in general sort of is similar in a way to the American cryptozoology scene, where you now at least have people who are investigating this and are taking reports and are actively looking for the Yowie and that sort of thing?
Yes, it's very similar now. In my experience, yes, we have some very well organised groups, such as Australian Yowie Research, AYR. They have their own website. Dean Harrison, a good friend of ours who helped us a great deal with reports for our book, he has an organisation. I think he's got about 40 people.
Wow.
In various states, from Queensland to Victoria, and they go out with. Dean is a fairly wealthy guy, and he has got an awful lot of high-tech equipment, infrared devices and so on and so forth. And they go out in camouflage gear, with the four-wheel drives and so on. And they put in a fair bit of time out there. They really give it their all because, and they've come up with some interesting stuff. Dean got interested because he had a particularly hair-raising encounter with a Yowie himself in the hinterland behind the Gold Coast in Queensland. I think in 1996, he was chased by a particularly cranky Yowie that seemed intent on ripping him limb from limb.
Oh, wow.
So it would have reduced me to jelly, but Dean's made of sterner stuff. He just wanted to get to the bottom of the mystery after that. And
one of the sort of sub-questions here I wanted to ask you about was that came up a couple times in the book, and you alluded to it just now when you were discussing the Aborigines. And that was that there's sort of a taboo aspect where they don't want to talk about it, or they'll tell you some things and then they'll be like, well, we can't tell you anything else though, or what, we can't, that there's things that about the Yowie that have to remain a secret, and that kind of strange sort of thing. And this is like a two-part sort of question coming out of that thought. First of all, why do you think they have that attitude? And the B part is, what do you think they're not telling us about the Yowie that maybe would shed some light on all this?
Yes, well, I hope I can give some sort of coherent response to that. It's because it's something we had to sort of be careful with in the book. We had to respect Aboriginal tradition and try and spell out their beliefs. Yes, it's strange. Some Aborigines, this has been reported by anthropologists and so on since the colonial era, and our own experience reflects this, that some Aborigines refuse to talk about the Yowie at all. They'll just change the subject or turn their back or say, oh, no, rubbish, never heard of it. I've talked to one Aborigine. I worked with him briefly down the coast, the south coast of New South Wales, in an area that I know all Aborigines, if not 90% of white people, believe in the Yowie. And I raised the subject with him, and he said, no, never heard of it, never heard of it. So he just didn't want to talk about it. Others will talk about it reasonably freely, and some, as you say, will say, yes, well, there are certain things about it, like for instance, the name in the Gudgeonborough clan in northeastern New South Wales. There was a young fellow, Kyle Slab, who told us an awful lot about his clan's interaction and knowledge of the hairy man. But one thing he wouldn't tell us was the name that they called, the word they used for the hairy man in his tribe. He said that this word was a word you had to say if you happened to meet one face to face. You had to, that was supposedly what you said. Now, the effect of that word, I don't know. Perhaps it was a greeting, or perhaps it was some kind of magic incantation. I'm just not sure, but he wouldn't tell us that. Ironically, when he first met a Yowie face to face, that word was the last thing in his mind. He just screamed and turned and ran. He said, and it was only later he remembered the tribal law. Yes, let me see. The Aboriginal law about these things. They generally, what they convey to me is that the creatures are real. That is, you can touch them, or they can grab you, or they might even grab a child and run off with it, either to eat it or kill it or something. And they certainly have been seen many times killing kangaroos and grabbing food out of campsites and so on. Yet at the same time, there's something spiritual about them, something uncanny. One Aborigine said to me in so many words, I said, well, how would you go about, could you photograph, or how would you go about catching one of these things? She said, oh no, they're real, but you can't catch them. You can't catch them. They're real, but you can't catch them. I've heard similar things many times. Even though, I was born and raised in Australia, and I've worked with Aborigines, and I'm interested in their culture and so on, and written a little bit about them, I don't pretend to know everything about them at all. And Paul, in fact, Paul Cropper is part Aboriginal, although he was raised by white people. But so he's lost his any direct knowledge there. But I don't pretend to really have a grip on the Aboriginal mindset about what is real and what is not, if you know what I mean. Yeah. I think their view, to generalise greatly, I think the Aboriginal worldview is a bit different from ours in that the line between the real world and the spirit world is a lot fuzzier. They, possibly the same with many Native Americans, they see, for one thing, they appear to see a spiritual side to everything, like every rock and every tree and every breath of air and drop of pollen has some kind of spiritual aspect, which actually I agree with myself, but I can't feel it, except on rare occasions. Whereas I think with them, particularly the ones who still live in the tribal structure, I think their view of what's real and what is not is different from ours. So they would naturally, I think, see some spiritual aspects to the yowie, because after all they see spiritual aspects to crows and kangaroos. But nevertheless, I think there's something about the yowie that, I mean, they don't have a taboo about talking about kangaroos, for instance. There's something awfully scary and awfully strange, I think, about the yowie. Call me superstitious, and perhaps this is jumping ahead a little in the conversation here, but I often think there's something rather uncanny about the yowie. I'm not sure what it is, but I kind of think the Aborigines might be onto something.
And in the book, you do a great job of sort of outlining what would be called the yowie hotspots, and you talk about the various parts of Australia that seem to have a lot of yowie sightings. And one of the aspects of the book that I did like a lot is that you address any sort of criticism before someone could make it, in a way, where you say, you know, these are yowie hotspots, but they might be yowie hotspots because we have a lot of investigators there. I have a lot of respect for that, instead of just leaving that open-ended so in case someone could come along and say exactly what you just said. You know what I mean? I appreciate that you address potential problems in your points, which is really awesome.
I wish everyone who read the book read it as carefully as you have, Tim. That's right. That's exactly what we were trying to do. We were anticipating, you know, people's questions.
Exactly.
Queries, yeah.
And one of the points that I wanted to make about these yowie hotspots is that you sort of make in the book, and you and Paul obviously make in the book, is that there's these situations here, what I dub as the neighborhood yowies, where there's families, and you have a couple of interesting cases in there with the Frost family and the O'Connor family, where they live sort of close to the border here between, as the cities expand and get closer into the wild part of Australia, there's sort of a fuzzy border there, and the people on the edge and in these hotspots is where there are these situations where there's a lot of interaction with the yowie. Can you talk about those cases of the neighborhood yowies, as I call them?
Yes, certainly, Tim. Yeah, that's right. There are a few places, such as the Gold Coast hinterland, where the city is expanding rapidly and the western edge is hitting some, well, inaccessible jungly areas, and also down in the Blue Mountains west of Sydney, where the city of Sydney has expanded westward and just run head-on into the escarpment of the Blue Mountains, which is an area of thousands and thousands of square miles, tens of thousands of square miles of ravines and jungle-covered cliffs, as wild as any country you can get. And the city of Sydney is then funneled down into essentially one road that runs through the Blue Mountains, and there are settlements along that road, and hundreds of people, hundreds and hundreds of houses in those settlements back directly onto this just amazing wilderness that stretches for hundreds of kilometres north and south. So the Frosts and the O'Connors are two such families. They live, their backyards front onto this wilderness. Neither of them coincidentally have a back fence, so their property ends where the jungle begins. Since the mid-1980s, Neil and Sandy Frost have had, well, as we know now, yowies occasionally visiting their property, coming up and staring through the windows or bashing the side of the house or stealing the dog food. For 8 years, the Frosts simply couldn't believe that this was going on. They knew that the footfalls were much too heavy for a human, and that whatever this creature was, it could charge through thick, thorny scrub in the middle of the night with no illumination. A human would get torn to shreds running around there at night. Eventually, however, they started to glimpse this creature. It seemed to be mainly one individual, which they they called Fatfoot because it had this sort of strange-looking footprints. They found footprints on 2 occasions. On the first occasion, it was actually very early in the time they were there. They'd just cleared their block to begin building the house, and there were clear footprints, a line of clear footprints in the soil. At that time, that was their very first experience. They just assumed someone was joking, that someone was walking around with big feet or something. So although they looked at the footprints, 8 years later, when they started to take the phenomenon seriously, they couldn't remember the exact shape of the footprints that had been there. The footprints that have appeared since have been less clear, but they have this funny, fat look about them, to use their term. But anyway, yes, every member of the family, the 2 parents and the boy and the girl have all seen the Yowie now. Neil is quite an ingenious fellow. He's a school teacher with a scientific bent, and he's rigged up cameras with tripwires. He's rigged up a infrared triggered camera. He's gone out night, hundreds of occasions with cameras at night and in the daytime looking around. He's managed to get 2 photographs, which he believes, and I think he's right, that both of these do show the Yowie, but as he cheerfully admits, neither photograph would convince anyone who's inclined to be sceptical, because they're just too indistinct. One simply shows glowing eyes, which a skeptic would say, well, it's a possum or something like that. But Neil knows that he was advancing on this creature and it was backing away. He could hear the big footsteps and other noises associated with them when he took the photograph. The other one was taken by his infrared camera, and when viewed under optimum conditions, that is, blown up on a colour TV monitor, you can see it looks like a black non-human face staring around a sapling, staring around a tree at him. But we couldn't use it in our book because, try as we might, when we converted it to black and white and reduced it to the size for the book, it just became a, what's that term?
Rorschach?
Rorschach, yes. So we thought it best not to use that. But yes, Neil's still trying. Every second week he phones up and says, well, they're back. He thinks the original one is now dead or gone. There seems to be a younger, slightly smaller one wandering around. His street, in his street, there are about 30 households where people have actually seen these creatures or had chickens killed or pets carried off or dog food removed. So it's an ongoing thing. And then he lives on the northern edge of Blue Mountain settlement. On the southern edge of the same settlement, about 2 kilometres away, live the O'Connors, Jerry and Sue O'Connor. And ever since they've moved into their property in 1997, they've had very similar experiences. These incredible lion-like roars, like a cross between a lion, a bear, or something. People grope for terms to express the sound that these creatures can make when apparently they're threatened or enraged. The Frosts and the O'Connors have heard those vocalisations, which were also mentioned by pioneers during the colonial era in the Blue Mountains. And the O'Connors, however, have a slightly different take, or a rather different take on the phenomenon than the Frosts. Whereas the Frosts are convinced these things are just big flesh and blood creatures who can see in the dark, and who are very intelligent and elusive. The O'Connors, after a year or two of experiences, are now quite convinced that they're dealing with something that's paranormal in some way. As Jerry says, these creatures, they can read your bloody mind, he said. I'm sure of it.
One of the stories that I wanted you to talk about, because it was amazing, it's an amazing story, and I'm not sure off the top of my head if it was the Frosts or the O'Connors, but I'm pretty sure it was one of them, attempted to get some audio recording of the Yowie and hid an audio recorder, and the result was an amazing story, and that's what I'd like you to tell now. And you put it in the book under Midnight Creeper. So, talk about the Midnight Creeper and the audio recording.
For sure. Well, Jerry O'Connor and his wife Sue has started to leave out food for their local neighbourhood Yowie, and they found that it appeared to like bread and peanut butter, amongst other things, different kinds of fruit, and the food was always taken. They of course they said, well, maybe possums had somehow got into these buckets that were suspended by wires from trees. So they started to string black cotton thread at a height of 6 feet from tree to tree horizontally around the area, and they found that this cotton thread was being broken when the food was being taken. So they assumed that it was the Yowie that was doing it. So on one occasion they got a voice-activated tape recorder and hid it in a stump, camouflaged it very carefully, just down the hill from their place on the edge of the forest. And they suspended a plastic bucket full of food from a tree that leant over a small cliff there, so that this bucket would be rather hard to get at, and it's an area where they themselves had glimpsed the Yowie in daylight, and a neighbour, Brad Croft, had seen one running across a track just downhill from there at night. But in any case, I've got a copy of the tape here, but the tape begins with the sound of Jerry saying, "Okay, I'm camouflaging the tape here. I'm moving away." You can hear his footsteps moving away, and then the tape is turned on once or twice by the sound of the wind and so on. And then through the Blue Mountains, alongside that road I mentioned, there is a railway, and coal trains move along there. And you can hear the sound of the coal train. I forget what time that indicated, but it was a handy time check for Jerry. It proved it was the middle of the night, or very early in the morning in any case. And then you can hear what sounds like big footsteps, crunch, 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 coming towards the area. And then I'm just trying to remember the sequence here. I'm madly thumbing through the book to try and find the section, but there were a few things registered. There was a great thump, hollow thump, which they found later was the sound of the food bucket being hit by something. The food bucket was split and thrown several meters from where it was hanging. Well, a possum couldn't do that. A human possibly could, a hoaxer or whatever. But it's a funny area for anyone to be wandering around in the middle of the night. Mm-hmm. Rather dangerous on the edge of that cliff, and very few people ever have ever been seen down there. There's just no reason for anyone to be there. So the bucket was smashed and the food taken. Then there's the rustling sound of something messing around the area of the camouflage stump, the foliage being removed, and then what sounds like something clawing at the plastic-covered tape recorder.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember if somehow it managed to turn the thing off. But in any case, no, I don't think it did. I think it just ripped the plastic covering. Yeah, ripped the plastic covering and strewed the foliage around a bit, and then wandered off. And there was later on the sound of another coal train indicating time frame, and I think in the morning a distant helicopter, and then the sound of Jerry approaching at 6 in the morning to check the tape. Well, Jerry showed me, he documented all this with photographs of the stump and so on prior to being discovered, and he maintains that nobody, even in broad daylight, would have been able to see anything in this stump. It was perfectly camouflaged, and at night no human being would have been able to find it. But he says, well, the yowie apparently its hearing was so acute that it could hear the tape operating in the stump. So that convinced Jerry, and he is one of these transparently honest individuals. I mean, of all the witnesses I've talked to, I'd put Jerry right up the top. He is a very honest man, and furthermore, he's adamant. He said he and his wife will willingly take lie detector tests to testify to everything that they've experienced, including this tape-recorded incident. And he swears on the grave of his child. He said, I swear, you know, he's so adamant. He said, people must believe this, because he, prior to moving to that house, he had no idea about any of this business. He was a retired Navy veteran, over 20 years in the Navy, and he said the whole experience of interacting with this yowie has spun his belief system on its heels.